Good evening. This is Nothing But the Truth, and I'm your host, Trudy Stern. I want to begin by wishing all of our listeners a very happy, healthy, and peaceful new year. As we start 2026, it's worth pausing for a moment to look back at the year we just lived through. Because when President Biden left office, the world was on fire. Wars were raging across multiple regions, deterrence had collapsed, America's adversaries were emboldened, and our allies were questioning whether the United States still had the will or the clarity to lead. One of President Trump's stated objectives was to end wars, restore deterrence, and reassert American strength on the world stage. So the question we have to ask honestly and without spin is this: did it work? Where did it succeed? Where did it fall short? And what does the global landscape look now as we head into 2026? Nowhere is that question more urgent than in the Middle East. Iran remains the central destabilizing force, a direct threat to the United States, to the West, and to Israel. Tonight, we'll examine where Iran stands today, its nuclear ambitions, its regional proxies, its military capabilities, and is there a possibility of regime change? At the same time, the players in the Middle East have shifted. Syria is no longer what it was. Turkey is far more emboldened. Power balances have changed, and we have to ask a hard question. Has the region and has the world simply exchanged one bad actor for another? To help us make sense of all of this, we are joined tonight by one of Nothing But the Truth's most trusted voices, and truly our resident expert, Jonathan Schanzer. Jonathan is a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, where he focuses on Middle East security, Iranian strategy, terrorism financing, and U.S. foreign policy. He previously served as a terrorism finance analyst at the U.S. Treasury Department and has advised policymakers at the highest levels. He is the author of several essential books on Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran's global strategy, and he is one of the clearest and most honest analysts working today. A stated goal of this show is to help our listeners become well-informed people, armed not with slogans, but with facts and truth. And time and again, Jonathan has come onto this program to do exactly that, to break through the noise, cut through the narratives, and explain what is really happening and why it matters. We're so happy to have Jonathan here today to unpack all of it. Welcome back, Jonathan, and such a happy, healthy new year to you.
Hi, Trudy. Great to be with you. Happy New Year.
So let's just start right out with a look back at 2025. Tell us your thoughts on how President Trump has done and has he achieved his goals?
Well, it's an interesting question. I'm not sure I know how to answer it without any doubts. And here's why. Deterrence is back. And I think a lot of that has to do with Donald Trump's unpredictable personality and the fact that he doesn't have a stated foreign policy. In other words, there is no Trump doctrine. We don't say, here are all the things that we're going to do and here's how we're going to do it. Every time we do that, that's exactly when our enemies start to scuttle our plans and make things harder for us. What I would say is that Donald Trump has definitely put the fear of Allah in Iran after bombing their nuclear program earlier this year, and deterrence was shot. The fact that he supported the Israelis in their strikes against Iran, again, eroding Iranian deterrence, is a good thing. But I got to say, when we look around the region in the Middle East, there's still a war. The war is on a low flame right now, but I suspect it's probably going to come back again in 2026. We can talk about how and why. In the meantime, Donald Trump has done a huge amount of work trying to bring the war in Ukraine to an end. Not been entirely successful. It doesn't mean that he's going to fail. Just means this is a long process, and it doesn't look like there are any easy answers. On top of that, we've actually opened up a new front in the Caribbean basin in particular, targeting narco boats, right? Targeting Venezuela, even a port in Venezuela just the other night in late December. So when you look around the region right now, or you look around the world rather, you see a world in conflict. And even the end of the Biden presidency, the rise of the Trump presidency, it didn't stop these wars. I think maybe the best way to frame this is that maybe it prompted some of our enemies to stop and think a little bit more before widening these conflicts. And I think maybe that's the one, real positive that we can hang our hats on from 2025. The question I have for 2026 is whether we can push some of these bad actors to finally end their regional designs for greater power. And that, well, I guess we'll find out soon enough.
So, do you think that all of these conflicts and wars that were erupting all over the place were connected by one common thread of a global war against the West? That these are not just isolated incidences all over the place?
Well, at FDD, we talk about something called the axis of aggressors. And I think this is an important concept for folks to understand. There are several states that would like nothing more than to see America's power weakened, to see our influence eroded. The leader is China. They're now the emerging superpower. They're rivaling the United States, both militarily and economically. And they're one to watch, by the way, because as much conflict as we've seen around the world in 2025, we could see more of it if China decides to invade Taiwan. But in the meantime, I mean, they're helping Iran restock its ballistic missiles, and they're working with the Russians. And the Russians are number two in this axis of aggressors, right? They're not just looking to weaken or take over chunks of Ukraine. They want to drive a wedge into Europe. They want to weaken NATO. They want to be the power in their region. And so we watch them working with the Chinese. On top of that, you've got Iran. And we know Iran's working both with the Russians and the Chinese. Although it was interesting, neither one of those countries truly came to Iran's aid during that June war. In June of 2025, we did not see them, come and help in ways that maybe Iran would have wanted to see back during that 12-day war in June. But you add these three powers together, they try to multiply their power by aligning with one another. They're an axis. You could maybe throw in North Korea or Venezuela in there as well. But the big three are the ones that I'm watching. Right now, I think the United States is still holding on as the number one spot in this competition. But we've got to fight against this unified axis if we're going to hold on to that spot in the long term.
So what I had just seen recently was that Iran was helping Venezuela and arming Venezuela. So it seems like all of these conflicts really are actually connected.
I think they are. And, we see it, a lot of it is economic, some of it's weapons, a lot of it is oil, right? I mean, the Chinese are buying up Iranian oil. The Russians and the Iranians are working together. Both of them are, essentially gas stations with an army. You kind of get a sense of how the oil economy is working to power these repressive political regimes. So yes, I see all of this as interconnected. And so the narco boats that are being targeted, they're part of a regime that aligns itself with the Chinese and the Russians. The United States, I mean, it's really interesting. The United States, if there is a strategy, a Trump doctrine, I think it is really, it appears to be strengthening America's economic power worldwide and rivaling the Chinese. And at the same time, getting our neighborhood in order. In other words, and you look right now what we're doing in Latin America, we're basically saying, Trudy, this is our neighborhood. So Russia, China, get out, right? We're taking control of this region again. This is our backyard. And I think that makes a lot of sense to me, because if you want to project power abroad, you're going to have a hard time doing it if you can't do it closer to home. So we'll start closer to home, and I think over time, hopefully project outward and weaken some of these countries as they try to expand their power in 2026, 27, and 28.
Very frightening landscape to look at, because one would look at Venezuela and think, oh, this whole narco situation is isolated and it's a drug issue, but it's not. And we've heard on this show with Admiral Mark Montgomery, another FDD fellow, that that drugs are another way of weakening society and weakening a democratic society. And this was definitely a way for them to aid in this global war, Venezuela to aid in this global war. So, in your opinion, do you think that Trump is sending a very strong message to Xi? Listen, we're aware of all of this, and we are handling it, and we are on top of it, and we are strong.
Oh, I mean, absolutely. When you look at what Trump is, I mean, closing down the border with Mexico, stopping the flow of fentanyl, blowing up these narco boats that are bringing cocaine and other drugs into the United States. We're stopping it. We're stopping the poisoning of American minds. We're actually stopping the flow of illicit finance from, I mean, in other words, these are US dollars that are flowing back to places like Venezuela and some of these narco kingpins. We're stopping all of that, right? And placing tariffs on the Chinese, bombing the Iranians, pushing the Europeans to start arming up to be able to defend themselves against Russia in this conflict or in future conflicts. All of this is about realigning the international order. And this is really important because I do think, I mean, you mentioned deterrence earlier. I do think that during the Biden era, we lost a lot of deterrence. I would argue that really even, during the first Trump administration, the chaos that we saw, not because of Trump, but because of just where we were in the world, right? I mean, looking at the COVID virus and some of the other disruptions that we saw even before that, the Arab Spring, the invasion of Ukraine. I mean, all of these things, I think, contributed to a sense that maybe the grip on power that America once had, that the US-led world order was crumbling to some extent. And I do think that it continued to crumble, and it is still very much in danger right now. But I do see a president that is doing whatever he can to project power again and try to restore some order. And in some ways, it's working. In some ways, we just don't know what the outcome is going to be because the genie's already out of the bottle. I mean, right? I mean, Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine before Trump came in. Now he's just trying to figure out how do we end this thing, right? I mean, Hamas attacked Israel before Trump came to office, and that battle's still ongoing. The president is doing what he can, I think, to support America's allies without getting us entangled in new wars. That's a big part of the MAGA movement. So he's threading a needle here, and it's going to be really interesting to see how all this plays out, especially because there are kind of two big, I don't know, camps within the Republican Party, right? They call them the globalists or the internationalists on one side, and the isolationists or neo-isolationists on the other. There's a whole camp of people that basically says, we don't want to get involved in anybody else's wars. We don't want anybody else's problems imported here. And then there's the other camp that says we need to keep the world a safer place if we don't want to see troubles come here to our shores. And if you remember, obviously 9/11, we ignored a whole bunch of problems for many years, and then eventually those problems came to our shores. There are a lot of people say we overlearned the lessons of 9/11. There are a lot of people who say we forgot them, but this is some of the debate that's playing out right now in the White House, in Congress, and across the Beltway.
So before we move on to the Middle East, just one last question about this past year, 2025. So would you say that America and the world is in a safer place today than we were January of 2025?
I think so, in the sense that I do believe that our enemies know that if they mess with us, there'll be consequences. And I think that's really important. At the same time, though, I want to warn that these conflicts continue to rage, maybe on a lower flame, but we are still seeing conflicts worldwide. So, in other words, we're safer in the sense that I think people fear us, maybe the way they should, the way that maybe they forgot. And that, I think, does make us safer. But the fact that we still see conflicts all over the world, right? In Africa, in Asia, in Europe, in the Middle East, that does not make me feel warm and fuzzy going into 2026, right? We still see that there are problems that need to be solved. And by the way, again, we got to ask ourselves, is it the job of the United States to go in and intervene and fix these conflicts? I don't know the answer to all of that, but I do know that this is going to be a pivotal year. as far as international security is concerned. 2026 will be a big one.
So let's move over to the Middle East and tell us what you think about what's going on right now. First, with regard to Israel and Hamas and the Gaza war, and where that plays out, and then next we'll move over to Iran.
Sure. On Gaza, I think it was a big day the other day in Mar-a-Lago for Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel. I think he got everything that he wanted, minus maybe one thing that he had hoped that the president would back him up on and didn't, as it relates to Gaza. Basically, the president came out and said that Hamas still needs to disarm, and that if it doesn't, that there would be hell to pay. And that's exactly what the Israelis hoped that he would say. I think it's interesting, though, because the key to that are the countries of Turkey and Qatar. And really the president needs to squeeze both of excuse me, of those regimes. President needs to just come down on both of those countries like a ton of bricks, and he hasn't done that yet. And that actually leads me to the one thing that Bibi was, I think, a little bit disappointed by, and that is that Trump still looks at Turkey as a possible partner, as a country that can contribute to Gaza's security. Let's just, I think it's important to remind folks here that the Turkish government has been a sponsor of Hamas. They still have a headquarters of Hamas in their country. They're major financiers. They provide them with all manner of support out of their country. And so it's a little disappointing to see the president still saying that the Turks are a worthy partner, and that Turkish troops maybe should be on the ground in the Gaza Strip. That's not a good thing. So we have to really we have to watch that space. But otherwise, I think Gaza has been, I don't want to say it's been a success, but I think the Israelis have navigated all the challenges. And at this point, Hamas is at its weakest that we have seen. They lost 47%, or no, they lost 53% of their territory in Gaza. And they're surrounded by the Israelis. And there are now calls by the president yet again for the group to disarm. That is a good thing, and I think it's a good way to be entering into 2026.
And where do you see Iran in all of this? How do you see Iran is facing its own challenges right now? You were on this program talking about the 12-day war and how incredible it was. So now we're some months later, and there is talk of them rearming, renuclearizing. Tell us about what you think with regard to Iran.
Sure. I mean, look, number one, you have to just let's bear in mind that all of the proxies are weaker. Okay. Obviously, Gaza, Hamas, weaker. Hezbollah, they're in bad shape. They're down, but they're not out. Syria, we don't see the Iranian proxies there anymore. We still have some problems, which we can talk about. Iraq has been quiet. They still have a lot of missiles, though, the Shiite militias. So we're concerned about those. And there are still missiles in Yemen, and we're concerned about those. And these are all proxies of Iran, and they can be ordered, if they're willing to take the order, they can be ordered to join like a campaign against Israel. The big question is whether the Iranian regime, whether they want to do that, whether that's in their interest. And, here, again, I think what Bibi got out of that visit to Mar-a-Lago was big, right? I mean, Trump basically said if Iran starts building up those missiles again, they're going to get hit, right? That's a threat to Israel and that he would not stand for it. So that's a big a deterrent, I would say, for the Iranians. But they have a significant missile arsenal. And that's what the Israelis are worried about right now. There are thousands of ballistic missiles, like the kinds that came down on Israel during the June war, that 12-day war. That is still a threat to Israel right now. And if Israel sees that missile arsenal grow, then we could see another Israeli preemptive strike, another big one like we saw in June. And that would lead to another big war in the Middle East. And that's not, no one's looking forward to that, but that's a possibility. The nuclear program, if you ask me, doesn't really exist. It will take 3 to 5 years to rebuild. And I think that's the good news. But the bad news is that we still have this missile war looming over the entire region. And now here's the big wrinkle. And you mentioned this, Trudy, and this is the fascinating part. The last few days, we've seen a new protest movement emerge within Iran. We already know that the regime lost a lot of deterrence after Israel started bombing during those 12 days. It lost even more deterrence after the United States came in and knocked out those nuclear facilities. The regime looked weak. It looked brittle. It looked fragile, but it held on. Now, months later, 6 months later, we're watching people come out into the streets. They're protesting against their regime. They're trying to knock out some of the security cameras. They're, yelling at police, at some of the security forces and the police forces on the streets. Some of these security forces have been on camera, kind of agreeing with the protesters at how terrible this regime has been. So we find ourselves yet again, and we've seen multiple iterations of this over the last, 15 years. Different protests come out onto the streets, and then usually the regime puts them down with a certain amount of brutality. The question is this the one that makes the difference? And I don't know how to answer that. I will say this. The Mossad came out and announced that they were with the protesters. It would be great to see Donald Trump come out and say that he's with the protesters. It would be great to see the CIA, the State Department, MI6, the foreign office in the UK, the Quai d'Orsay in France. I mean, all of these different foreign ministries and intelligence services that are Western oriented should be calling for the downfall of the regime. They should be encouraging the people of Iran to come out into the streets and finally bring this odious regime to the downfall that it deserves.
Well, isn't it possible that they are actually doing that? All of these foreign entities, they're not just announcing it.
It's possible. And if that were the case, then I would welcome it. Let's just say that if we've been watching the behavior of the Brits and the French and the Germans and a lot of these other Europeans, I got to say, they've not been profiles in courage. Not during the Gaza war, not during the Iran war. We've just not seen it. I mean, let me just say, the Brits have done their part. They scrambled jets out of Cyprus and they knocked out some of the drones and missiles that were fired by Iran at Israel. So I don't want to throw them all under the bus, but I would just say they have not been brave as it relates to this war. They've been kind of, triangulating. They've been vacillating. When I look at this war, this is a war of Iran and its proxies against Israel. There is a right and a wrong, right? You can say what you want about Palestinians and self-determination. It's fine. But look, we're not talking about the Palestinians here. We're talking about Iran and its terror proxies. And that needed to be condemned. And it needed to be condemned throughout the last 2 years plus. And that's not what we've seen out of the Europeans. And it's for that reason that I'm not sure that they're going to be there where they need to be on Iran. But, let's wait and see. This is a big moment for the region if these protests continue.
Well, I did see on the news that Crown Prince Pahlavi looks very ready to jump right back in. So we'll see what happens with that. Moving on to the next topic, which is now that Iran seems to be somewhat of a question with regard to what's going to happen with their regime, it seems like the regional power is shifting a bit. The new government in Syria and a far more emboldened Turkey. So are we witnessing, can you speak about that? And are we witnessing a replacement of one very dangerous actor, meaning Iran, with another, Turkey?
Sure. I mean, first, let's just, with Syria, we see the Turks involved there very heavily. And the Qataris, too. They're the money. And the Turks are the muscle, right? And I think that's how we understand this. This is a sort of a Muslim Brotherhood state, if you will. But it's brittle, right? I'm still not convinced that Ahmad al-Shara, the president of Syria, will be in the same seat in another year. 2026 could be a fateful year for Syria. It's not a very stable regime. But I think the bigger picture is Well, that's the important thing that you're alluding to, and that is that Turkey has regional ambitions. That we call it this neo-Ottoman ideology, that they were once the great Ottoman Empire and they're trying to revive it. And when you look around right now in the region, they've got their hooks in Gaza through Hamas. We actually see influence in Lebanon right now. They've been providing some assistance to Hezbollah, which is very strange given that this is traditionally an Iranian terrorist organization and the Turks are involved. How much, we're not sure, but we know that weapons and cash from Turkey are getting there. Isolated reports, but reports nonetheless. They have a huge amount of influence in Syria. They've got a large amount of influence in Iraq because they've got their problems with the Kurds, and there's a huge Kurdish presence there. Then go actually to Africa, and you see the Turks there as well. They're involved in places like Libya, the Horn of Africa, Sudan. They have been expanding influence on an alarming rate. And so there are those that say that as Iran possibly finds itself pushed into a corner and maybe even be on the verge of collapse, depending on what happens with these protests, that there's a new aspiring regional power that's looking to make a power play, and that's Turkey. And there was a scholar by the name of Bernard Lewis. He was a famous scholar of Islam from Princeton University who said that he said this like I think it was in the 1980s. He said that one day Turkey will become Iran and Iran will become Turkey. And it may be that he was very prophetic when he said those words, because I think he understood that Turkey was on an Islamist trajectory. And he also understood that the people of Iran are very pro-West and would probably lean more toward the United States and the West if given the opportunity. And so this may be the dynamic. I don't know whether we're going to see a sort of a swap, a one for one, but it does look like they're kind of increasingly at this crossroads of sorts. And now the question is, does Turkey try to really expand its power at this moment? Does it become the aggressor? It's a very dangerous thing to consider that this is the second largest army in NATO. They house American, not just American servicemen and jets and the like, but the rumors out there, at least what's reported in the open source, is that they house American nukes.
So, okay. So, in your opinion, do you think that Turkey being a NATO country, do you think that makes them even more of a powerful and possibly bad actor here? Like they like a sheep in wolf's clothing, or wolf in sheep's clothing, as I didn't want to mix
Yeah.
them up.
I mean, I'll just say this. We joke that NATO is like that song, The Hotel California. You can check out, but you can't leave. That's kind of what's going on with the Turks. There is no mechanism for removing a country from NATO. So once you're in for as long as you want to be there. But mentally, they're not there. They're not part of the Western-led alliance, in my opinion. They don't act like that. So, I mean, I think they're already making a mess out of the NATO alliance. And then I think there's this other question, or maybe two questions that Israelis are asking right now. One is, if the Turks provoke Israel and Israel responds, and let's say they have to hit Turkish assets in Syria, does that invoke Article 5 of the NATO alliance? Right? The NATO charter says if someone is hit, then all the other NATO countries are supposed to come to their rescue and to work with them in the common defense of the alliance. That's a weird question to ask when you're talking about, the U.S. and its relationship with Israel and its relationship with NATO. I don't know how to navigate any of that. I do think there's a difference, though, between attacking Turkey in Turkey versus attacking Turkey if they're doing something provocative out of a country like Syria. But that is one scenario. I think the other thing that we continue to hear about right now out of Israel is, how do they classify countries like Turkey or even Qatar? They're not avowed enemies, but they're not allies and they're not neutral. They're hostile actors that Israel would not like to be at war with, but also can't let them continue to run around the Middle East making a mess out of the region. So there are a lot of really interesting, thorny, difficult questions that the Israelis are grappling with right now as the map is actually changing in real time.
So, sadly, we have time for one more question. And I want to go back to something you alluded to earlier, which was 2026 is going to be a very important year. Can you tell us what we should be looking forward to in 2026 with regard to all of these topics?
Sure. I mean, okay, close to home. We need to look at this narco strategy. We need to find a bipartisan approach that will allow a war on drugs, war on the narco kingpins to continue in a way that does not create chaos inside Washington. And so that's one thing that I'm looking for right now. I'm looking for, a process that brings everybody together in support of taking out these drug shipments that have been destined for the United States and that are poisoning the minds of our young people, or maybe young and old for that matter. So I'm watching that very carefully. I'm watching what's going on. I mean, we didn't even talk about it, but there's a massive civil war in Sudan. There's growing conflict in the Horn of Africa. Africa is going to be a huge, important place for the competition over rare earth minerals and other resources. The Chinese are there, the Russians are there, the United States are there. I'm going to be watching for a power play in that space. We're always concerned about Taiwan and a possible Chinese invasion. We are obviously watching that multi-front war in the Middle East and where things are going with a possible showdown between Israel and Iran. But as I just mentioned, let's also keep an eye on Turkey. Let's keep an eye on the Qataris, right? You have some new power players coming into the mix that are trying to reshape the map of the region. Then, of course, we've got Europe, the Ukraine crisis and whether the Europeans can hold it together, in the name of a Western-led alliance, a U.S.-led alliance. But I think the big thing, Trudy, to watch throughout all of this is American leadership. Do we continue to direct our allies to act in our interests and in their interests to counter our adversaries and our enemies? This is the big question, right? Are we receding? Are we pulling into ourselves here and kind of, saying that what's happening out there in this dangerous world, it's not our problem? Or are we still trying to shape the world that we live in? I think that will it may vary region to region. But to the extent that we're able to answer that question, I think that will explain to us how safe or how dangerous the world will be in 2026.
Wow, lots to think about and lots to watch. And we will count on you to come in and really, break it all down for us as these things unfold. So, Jonathan, thank you so much for joining us tonight and once again bringing clarity to a very complex and dangerous moment in world affairs. Your ability to cut through the noise, connect the dots, and explain what is really happening, not just in the headlines, but in strategy and in consequences, is exactly why we value you so much on this show. Tonight's conversation made clear that the challenges we face in 2026 are not isolated events, but part of a broader global struggle that affects America, Israel, and the entire West. Understanding that reality is essential, and you've helped equip our listeners with the knowledge that they need to see the world truly as it is. So we are always so grateful to have you with us, Jonathan, and we look forward to continuing this conversation as events unfold.
Thanks, Trudy. Happy New Year.
Happy, healthy. To our listeners, thank you so much for joining us. This has been Nothing But the Truth with Trudy Stern. You can catch us every Thursday at 9:30 p.m. on the radio, but if you missed any part of this show or want to listen to past episodes, you can find Nothing But the Truth wherever you get your podcasts. For now, stay strong, stay informed, and keep seeking nothing but the truth.